So if you've been on the internet at all recently, there's a pretty good chance that you've at least heard that Bethesda could be making a new Game of Thrones game. And whether or not the rumors are true, I'm sort of on the fence about this whole thing. Personally, I think Bethesda is a good company, and they've made some of my favorite games in the past. I'm just not sure if I really trust them with something of this magnitude that's near and dear to so many people's hearts. So instead of getting caught up in all the usual speculation like everyone else seems to be doing, I wanted to take a new approach and think about, well, if this thing actually is true, what are at least 5 things Bethesda has to get right in order for this game to be successful? For starters, let's begin with the obvious. In order for this game to have an impact, not just on players but also on the gaming industry, similar to other power hitters out there like The Last of Us or The Witcher 3, Bethesda needs to nail a mature writing style that feels right at home with the Game of Thrones books or show. Trust me, I know this may be a rather generic point, and you could say all games need to have at least a decent writer. But this is a far cry from Bethesda's strong suit. And even though they have a ton of material to go off of, I'd say Bethesda's still gonna have to bite the bullet this time and maybe hire some new writers. Or at the very least, take a step away from what they're used to in order to give us a world that isn't so black and white, but rather all shades of gray. Especially now that they could be creating something for a series that pretty much thrives on its writing and ability to surprise fans. So what exactly does that mean in comparison to their older games, such as Skyrim for instance? Well, for starters, I think it means a greater focus on more grounded material, such as sex, betrayal, and the harsh realities of war, like famine or disease. You know, I think it would even be a shame if at any point during the game's story, there became a clear-cut villain, or even if I just felt safe from any of the other characters, because that's really not what Game of Thrones is about. It's more so about always watching your back. With that being said, I do want to move on to our next point, which is a well-made map. I'll be the first to admit that Bethesda has made some pretty amazing ones in the past, but there is still a key difference between those and what a Game of Thrones map should be like. For example, Bethesda games are quite often very large, yet at the same time, they always take place in one central area like Skyrim or the city of Boston, which tends to work great for the games they make. But in order for Game of Thrones to really feel like the books or show, I believe they should take more of a Witcher 3 approach and have different zones you could travel to, like Dorne or the Iron Islands. That way we aren't stuck up north or in King's Landing the entire game. Plus, with the ability to travel to different areas, not only do you get a chance to see some different scenery, you also get to face off against different types of enemies and wildlife, and little things like that tend to work out really well when it comes to mixing up the gameplay. Speaking of changing things up, the next thing I want to bring up is a large-scale combat. I chose this because I think Game of Thrones has a very nice balance when it comes to the combat. Sometimes you have these huge house-ending battles, and other times the fights are only between a couple characters. To be fair, Bethesda does pretty well at the small-scale stuff, and sure, their combat can be a bit clunky at times, but maybe with a new engine, something like that could be ironed out. That being said, it's the large-scale battles that I'm really worried about, because a Game of Thrones game really does deserve to have hundreds of guys out there on the battlefield. And the most I've ever seen in any Bethesda game has only been about 13 people per side. Not to mention, we've never really seen any sort of siege system in their games, which could be crucial when it comes to getting inside castle walls. Other than that, I'm not sure much else needs to be said aside from the fact that they should also keep combat feeling as varied as possible by including as many other forms of it as they can, such as naval combat or at least some cavalry, because without those, I'm not sure factions like the Ironborn or Dothraki would feel true to how we've seen them before. Of course, everything I've listed so far is actually pretty dependent on the time period, so I also want to touch on that. As of now, there are so many ways this thing could end up going. I mean, it could take place during one of the books, all of the books, or quite possibly even before any of them. And honestly, that's what I'm leaning towards, because as much as I love the show, I'm not sure fans are going to want to play through the same exact events. Not to mention, for those who have already seen the show or read the books, it's going to be pretty damn hard for Bethesda to throw in any big surprises or betrayals that actually have an impact, especially if we already know they're coming. So what exactly do I want to see then? Well, I'd prefer a nice middle ground, such as Robert's Rebellion, just because it's far from being the main focus of the show, but at the same time I know it's been talked about quite a bit in some of the books. This way Bethesda has something to follow, and also a bit of freedom to throw in a few of their own stories. Plus, the Rebellion doesn't take place that long before the show starts, so fans are still going to get to see a lot of familiar faces, such as young Ned Stark, or even a younger Jorah Mormont. Lastly, in order to truly live up to the show, this game, without a doubt, needs to give players difficult choices that have lasting effects on both the world and its characters. In past Bethesda games, we have had a fair amount of choice, but they've never really been on the same level as, say, CD Projekt Red, where in some cases, choices you make at the very beginning of the game end up affecting you way later on down the road, or even end up deciding the fate of an entire house, such as in Skellige. And truth be told, that kind of player choice and consequence is way closer to what we need to see for something like Game of Thrones, where taking one step in the wrong direction could lead to the death of a character, even if it doesn't take an immediate effect, like Grayscale, for instance. Now, just in case you're not all caught up on the books or the show, I'll leave it at that for now, otherwise we'll really start getting into some spoiler territory. So let me know, what kinds of choices would you want to see in a Bethesda-style Game of Thrones game? And what else do you think Bethesda needs to do in order for this thing to end up being successful? That being said, thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you did enjoy the video, and as always, I will see you in the next one.